jurisdiction tied to, registering your space objects on your national registry. So we have national activities and appropriate states. We have launching states, these concepts of launching states, and we have registering states. And you see, and Martin showed that graph that was a triangle of how these topics are interlinked. So I'm going to focus on this in this presentation on these interlinked topics of responsibility and liability, and you will see how it is linked to these larger topics or these other related topics like registration. But first, let's return to where we get these topics and these issues of responsibility, beginning with Article 6 again, Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty. So the Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty is 3 sentences long. It is, and space lawyers return to it again and again. It is the most important article for national regulators. And national regulators and lawmakers return again and again to what Article 6 says, how it says it, and in fact, what it doesn't say, because it is the basis for national space legislation. So again, this first sentence, which we always return to, state parties to the treaty shall bear international responsibility for national activities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, whether such activities are carried on by governmental agencies or by non-governmental entities, and for assuring that national activities are carried out in conformity with the provisions set forth in the present treaty. So let's drill into and focus some of the phrases that are used there. That state parties to the treaty bearing international responsibility. Responsibility essentially just means being answerable for, being responsible for, being the entity that must explain or answer or be held accountable for those activities. You are internationally responsible on a state-to-state level, not necessarily talking about responsible to private entities or responsible to individuals, but a state is responsible to other states, and in fact to the international system. And what are they responsible for? What are they answerable for? National activities. And we will look at what national activities are, and that really is kind of the link between jurisdiction, control, launching states. You want to be answerable for your national activities and have that pretty much be the same as the objects which you launch and the objects which you place on your national registry. But it's not so simple, as we see. And that responsibility is over both your national activities, your national space agency, what you do as a nation, government, civil, military, but you're also internationally answerable for your non-governmental entities, meaning private entities, including private commercial companies, and in fact, even universities, down to the university level. It certainly seems as though you could be internationally answerable for even what your private entities do. And that is, I point that out because that is unique in international law, or it's very rare in international law for a state, a government, to be responsible for what a private company does, what the private university even does. But that is a critical element and an important element that we look to again and again in space law. So the conclusion, we look at Article 6, Sentence 1, both governmental and non-governmental activities are all potentially national space activities of at least one nation. Sentence 2, this is really the link and the rationale for having national space legislation, as I believe Rosanna Hoffman talked about yesterday. The activities of non-governmental entities in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall require authorization and continuing supervision by the appropriate state party. So here we again see some important phrases cropping up and arising. Activities of non-governmental entities, as I pointed out on the previous slide. But we see this phrase authorization and continuing supervision. Now, I want to focus on that word continuing because the drafters could have used different words. They could have used continuous or continual, but they use the word continuing. The word continuous or continual means that it is 24 hours a day. It never stops. It never ceases. But they didn't use the word continual. They use continuing, meaning that it may start, then stop, then start, then stop. And it is up to the state to determine the level, the extent, the intensity of that continuing supervision. Governments have a job to do before launch, looking at the mission profile, the parameters, the operators, frequency coordination, launch licenses, payload reviews. They have a job to look at the launch facility, but they have, that at that moment of launch, leading up to launch, but they also have authorization to do during operations in space, and likely a job to do even after the mission has ended, in order to ensure the safety and sustainability of space activities. That continuing supervision by a government is not 24 hours a day, but it is long-lasting, long-lived, and it seems to be for all moment, or for many areas and many times during the mission itself. Who's doing this authorization and supervision? Well, it just says the appropriate state party. And I think that's really the link that we get to when we start talking about multinational space activities, where there's joint launching states, where there's multiple launching states, where there's multiple states involved. The appropriate state party to the treaty shall be the one doing the authorization and supervision. So we have to ask, when we look at some of these scenarios, is the non-governmental entity a national activity? Does it involve your nationals? Does it begin with, or will it be directed from within that state's territory? Do you want it to be subject to your laws, or does it have only a small or transient link to your state or your territory or your government? Do you want it to be your national activity? Or would other states see it as part of your national activity? In other words, would you be internationally responsible and liable for it? Those are all questions to determine whether you are the appropriate state which should do the authorization and supervision. And then, just for the sake of completeness, I wanted to include sentence 3 of Article 6, which really places the same obligations on international organizations. Creating that link between states, and when states do space activities, part of international organization. It's a little bit outside the bounds of what I want to talk about today, but again, back in the 60s, they wanted to place this requirement also on international organizations. So, as was discussed yesterday, many states already have national space legislation. Some states with space activities actually don't have national space legislation yet, but they do. According to the USA website, 43 states have some form of national space legislation. And why should they have it? Well, Article 6, authorization and supervision. Not only are they tasked with authorization, they have that task of authorizing and supervising their national activities, but they're also, the incentive is that they're internationally responsible for their national space activities. So it seems a good idea, a good policy decision, to have some type of regulatory framework over all of your national activities and how you're going to authorize and supervise and lay down the rules for what your national actors are doing, including your commercial actors. So part 2, I want to get into a subset of responsibility, which is liability. And you're seeing how these concepts overlap with each other. So Article 7 of the Outer Space Treaty creates this element of liability, this concept of liability. Each state party to the treaty that launches or procures the launching of an object into outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, and each state party from whose territory or facility an object is launched, is internationally liable for damage to another state party to the treaty or its natural or juridical persons by such object or its component parts on the Earth, in airspace, or in outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies. I apologize for a long sentence with many commas and clauses there, but it aimed to be comprehensive and to encompass all possible situations. Looking into it, we see that there are 4 categories of launching state. They kind of overlap, but they wanted, again, to be inclusive and have a list that seemed to encompass a lot of categories of how to be a launching state. So a state merely which launches, common sense, did they launch it? Or if they procured that launch and maybe it launches from another state or another territory, the state which procures that launch could be considered the launching state. Additionally, if some other state launches on your territory or your facility, you can be considered a launching state. So, right, in fact, in the logic of the sentence, in the grammar of the sentence, we see the possibility of joint launching states, multiple launching states. And if you are a launching state, you are internationally liable for damage. Questions, of course, have arisen about what is damage, what is not damage. And as we see, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 was further developed into a further treaty, the 1972 Liability Convention, which clarifies and expands some of these concepts like damage, and how liability will be apportioned and discussed, and how obligations of liability will be apportioned to different actors. So in that liability convention, we see what damage actually means. The term damage means loss of life, personal injury, or other impairment of health, or loss of or damage to property of states or of persons, natural or juridical, or property of international intergovernmental organizations. So some definition of damage is what we have. Maybe this is not perfectly adequate and perfectly clear, but we have at least some effort to try and define what damage means. A few elements of it: loss of life, personal injury, or other impairment of health, or loss of or damage to property, or property of states or other juridical persons. I want to talk a little bit about liability and what damage means. So, as we know, and as was stated yesterday, space activities are seen as inherently risky. And for further evidence of that, look at the preamble of the Liability Convention, which reflects that notion, taking into consideration that, notwithstanding the precautionary measures to be taken by states and international intergovernmental organizations involved in the launching of space objects, damage may on occasion be caused by such objects. So the logic of space law understands that space activities may cause damage, and that space activities are inherently risky because they're rockets, they're things traveling at high speeds, they're things outside of states' territory, and the technology is challenging. So they meant, and they built into the logic of the Liability Convention that, see that first point, causing damage in the course of space activities is not unlawful. That last sentence, causing damage is not a violation of international law. It merely gives rise to the provisions of international liability, namely an obligation to pay restitution for damage. So when I explain liability and responsibility, I again say that liability is a subset of responsibility. Picture some type of Venn diagram where liability is a smaller component part of responsibility. It's not unlawful if a state causes damage in the course of its space activities. It merely gives rise to the provisions that, okay, you've caused damage as we've defined it. Now you're under a further obligation to pay some type of restitution or compensation for that. And here are the provisions for it in the Liability Convention. And as was discussed in the last presentation about how liability works, how it is apportioned, and its link with registration, you see that liability is tied to these launching states. It is tied to the whether a state falls under the definition of a launching state. So the Liability Convention has these further provisions about how liability will work out, how it is, discussed. There's absolute liability on the surface of the Earth, but fault-based liability in space. Article 2 on the left side of the screen talks about liability on the surface of the Earth or to aircraft in flight, and a different regime, a fault-based regime for damage caused in space, elsewhere than on the surface of the Earth. Absolute liability does not ask how is someone acting, what did they know, what did they intend to do. They merely ask, was damage caused, and who's the owner of the object that caused that damage. It doesn't look into any awareness or any actions or any duty of care. It's a absolute liability standard, strict liability. Whereas Article 3 has a different regime for in the space domain, looking at the behavior of the actors and what they knew and how they acted. It says, in the event of damage being caused elsewhere than on the surface of the Earth, skipping a few lines, the latter shall be liable only if the damage is due to its fault or the fault of persons for whom it is responsible. So we look at this logic of the liability convention, and we see that, okay, if you're on the surface of the Earth and you suffer damage from a space object, you are blameless. We're not going to look at how how you behaved. You just suffered damage, and now whoever caused that damage is under absolute liability to pay compensation. But if you're actually doing things in outer space, we're going to look at your behavior. Fault-based liability in space looks at the behavior of those actors. Some standard of care is required. We'll look at the intention, but also the knowledge and level expertise and know-how. So if you're in space, yeah, we're going to be looking at deeper into how you behave and how you perform. So that's the standards that we have. But the liability convention also has these discussions of how we will pay compensation. And if you do cause damage, again, not illegal to cause damage, but now you are under a duty to pay compensation. Article 12 says the compensation which the launching state shall be liable to pay for damage under this convention shall be determined in accordance with international law and the principles of justice and equity. Very interesting phrase there. In order to provide such reparation in respect of the damage as will restore the person, et cetera, to the condition which would have existed if the damage had not occurred. So this is not damage, or this is not a amount that is a punishment to those causing damage. It's merely to put the victim, the actor which suffered the damage, back to the condition that they would have been had the accident not occurred, had the damage not occurred. We call that compensation in the form of restitution. And they use that phrase, restore the person. Financial payment to the victim to make whole or to restore them. And likely, the form of that is monetary damage. You suffered this damage in space. Your spacecraft was destroyed or damaged or degraded in such a manner. What financial amount will put you back to the condition you would have been otherwise? Now, in the last couple of minutes, I do want to talk about enforcement in space law. Space law is linked with space law is linked with the rest of international law through Article 3 of the Outer Space Treaty. I've highlighted that phrase in blue, in accordance with international law. States conduct space activities in accordance with international law. Consequently, the rules of state responsibility that exist in general international law are applicable to space activities. So these concepts that we have in space law about responsibility and liability, they exist in space law, but it also has this link with the rest of international law and the relations between states. And therefore, we can talk about the International Law Commission and the International Court of Justice, forums for, settling disputes between states. And what does responsibility mean, and what does international responsibility mean on the international level, at this general international level? We talk about if a state has an obligation in international law and it violates that obligation, it is responsible. So, keeping in mind that this is a very deep topic, which you can explore very, very deeply, but these are the main rules to understand at the international level. We have this concept of an internationally wrongful act. Article 2 of these articles on state responsibility, an internationally wrongful act is an act or an omission which is attributable to a state and which constitutes a breach of an international obligation. So even as I write, if the obligations that we have in the Outer Space Treaty are vague, in fact, they are binding international obligations and they create state responsibility. So the obligation, let's think about some of the obligations that we have in space law. An obligation to register your space object if you're a party to the registration convention, an obligation to treat astronauts as envoys of mankind, or obligation in Article 9 to pay due regard to the corresponding interests of states. Those are binding obligations, even if they are seem to be vague. And in international law, we can have obligations that require us to do something or require us to not do something, a prohibition. But anyway, I say this to say, if a state does not observe that obligation, it could be considered an internationally wrongful act, and the state could be internationally responsible or answerable for that, or for the violation, for the non-observance of their international obligation. Again, I'm just saying this to link space law with the rest of international law and talk about responsibility of states. And if you do not observe your international obligations, there's consequences of that. Well, in fact, just because you've breached your obligation doesn't mean that you can continue to breach it. You have a continued duty to perform that obligation, including your obligation in space law. You have an obligation to stop the violation, cease that act if it is continuing, or offer appropriate assurances or guarantees of non-repetition. And here, in general state responsibility, there may be an obligation to make reparations. The responsible state is under an obligation to pay full reparation to the injury caused by the international wrongful act, including damage, whether material and moral. So we can contrast that with liability in space law for damage. So if you cause damage in outer space, you may be under a liability, a duty of liability. But if you violate your obligations in space law that are not causing damage, this is the phrase which matters: reparation, full reparation. And in fact, full reparation may include damage. A broader conception of the consequences of your violation. I think at that point, I'd like to cease my remarks and answer some of the questions or open the floor for questions. But what I wanted to, lastly get to, we've gone into these concepts of responsibility and liability, and I hope that you can see it linked with some of the other presentations, especially those presentations on national space legislation and that presentation which preceded mine on registration of space objects. So you can see these interlinked concepts of responsibility for your national space activities, liability if you cause damage, and the fact that you have jurisdiction and control if you are a registering state. So there's different concepts of registering states, launching states, and responsible states, internationally responsible states for national space activities. I'll stop sharing my screen, and I look forward to questions. And for those who put questions in the chat, I will also try and type out an answer there.
Muchísimas gracias por esta muy interesante presentación. Iba muy en la línea de las preguntas que se habían hecho anteriormente. Ofrezco la palabra.
Thank you very much. It was actually very, very nice and clear explanation. And Well, sorry, my name is Rodrigo Suarez. I'm the first vice president of the Chilean Space Association. And I would like to know who will decide if I already suffered or not a moral damage. Is there any kind of judge or jury that could decide that? Because I can say something, but the state could not recognize it. Thank you.
Interesting question. I think that many people would weigh in on that discussion, and certainly, a private individual or a non-governmental entity would have to convince a state, and then that state would potentially bring that claim to the other state, which is alleged to have caused these types of injuries. Here is where the law meets policy and diplomacy. Discussions would be held, and possibly it could be adjudicated just between state-to-state discussions. If it is not, there's that possibility that arbitrators and courts could get involved to determine that. But in making that argument, there should be some basis already in previous cases, in previous examples, that has a solid foundation so that who's ever making these claims can point to something which has already been determined and say, we're merely asking someone to look at, the way that these things have already worked in the past. That's an unsatisfactory answer, but this is how the law often works.
Muchas gracias. Siguiente pregunta.
Hi, Christopher. My name is Walter from the Chilean Air Force. I have a question on the subject of liability, more specifically on the definition of what constitutes damage. And in your opinion, for a country that has a very strong astronomy context, could it be considered damage, the obstruction on the sky caused by the satellite constellations, made for example, by Starlink?
This is an excellent question, and this gets to this topic that we have at Copus, Dark and Quiet Skies. Does this cause damage? If, your sensor on the ground looking at, doing space exploration, space science is looking at distant galaxies and quasars and objects in the universe, and it costs so much to have that one image of a distant galaxy. It costs, the observing time, the staff, the electricity, to make your observatory function and run. And your scientific findings cost money. And you have Starlink streaks across your image. Is that damage? We're stretching the notions of damage, but what is the where's that damage caused? We're looking at absolute liability under the Liability Convention. I am a proponent that national observatories on the ground, that this is a national space activity. It may not be a Article 6 activity, but it is under Article 1, exploration and use of outer space. And even if we don't have that discussion, damage is being caused on the surface of the Earth by spacecraft in space. This is just my personal opinion, and we will have differing opinions on this. But certainly we can look at the loss of observing time, the cost of that space, of that science activity being affected, impacted, degraded by what's happening in the space domain. I know that that's a controversial notion, because traditionally we have looked at damage in space law as something that happens in outer space, between two space objects. But certainly if your spacecraft re-enters and crashes into the surface of the Earth, that looks like absolute liability. So yeah, we'd have to look at these definitions in space law about liability. We would take into account that space law is a victim-oriented regime, and even if it's not liability under space law, there's still international responsibility, which I talked about, under general international responsibility under those articles on state responsibility. So that's my argument based on I want to protect dark and quiet skies, and I do see space exploration from telescopes on the Earth as space science that matters. But I encourage you, if you're in person, have a discussion with some of the space lawyers in person, and you may hear some differing views. But we do want to protect space exploration, including telescopes on the ground under dark and quiet skies. And this is a activity and discussions that happen at COPOIS under dark and quiet skies. So thank you for the question and for opening that conversation on that.
La oportunidad para una última pregunta. Ok. Bueno, entonces no resta más que agradecer la exposición que ha efectuado el señor Johnson y pasar al siguiente acápite del programa. Creo que es Rosana. Please.
Thank you so much. I hope that the morning presentations were very informative for you. I also hope that you did your homework yesterday, that you read through the scenarios that we have specifically, in fact, created for you after many months of discussions with the Air Force to see which topics maybe might interest you the most. And in fact, I would like to just briefly, before my actually colleague from ESA, it's not her job, but she's been so kind and will assist me a bit in this workshop phase, we'll put you into groups. So we will have groups of 4, group 1, group 2, group 3, and group 4. You will stay in these groups for the next 2 days. So the scenario that, apologies, we will look at now is scenario 1. Scenario 1 has a few questions for you to answer. It does not need to be long answers. It does not need to be detailed. I would very much advise you to work with the treaty booklet because, in fact, you should be able to answer to, let's say, the most extent, everything by looking into the articles of the treaties, the articles that Chile has ratified, specifically in the Outer Space Treaty pertaining to Scenario 1 and also in the Liability Convention. Today you had presentations about liability and responsibility by Christopher Johnson, and I'm very thankful for him to give you that very important information. You had presentations yesterday on the fundamentals of space law, and the combination of this information hopefully will also help you in the exercise. This is a small version of the text that you have in your document, so please read that again in detail. Now, how will we continue? You have 45 minutes until I think we continue with presentations, not yet lunch, with presentations. Please use those 45 minutes. We do not yet have to create the PowerPoint or like any type of document because you have time to do that tomorrow. One person in the group tried to write down your answers that you decide on. My colleague will now put you into groups, but before we do that, I am here to answer any questions you have on the technical aspect, not the content, the technical, before we get started. Or is everything very clear? It's clear to everyone? Yes? One more point I would like to make. The reason we are here in person, we could also do this online. The reason we are here in person is so that we can help you. So please take maybe 20 minutes to work in the group. And then my colleagues and I, we will go from group to group to see which direction you're going. If you're going maybe a little bit in the wrong, we try to move you in the right direction. We will not give you the answers, but we will try to assist you with any questions you might have. Thank you so much, and I very look forward to the outcomes that you will share with us. Okay, so I asked my colleague to put you into groups. You do the rounds. I would ask you, and I'm sorry for this, that we create a group 1 here, group 2 here, group 3 here, and group 4 over there, because you have to work together in the groups. Okay, thank you so much. Sí. Scenario 1, yes. No, discussion points 1. So that means questions 1. You need to read all of the scenario. Yes, but it's the questions from discussion point 1. I show you.